He was a king's son, raised in splendor, yet his life ended in flames on a lonely mountainside. Prince George, Duke of Kent, moved through a world of privilege, scandal, and wartime duty, always under the shadow of the crown. Then, in 1942, disaster struck without warning, leaving behind questions that lingered for decades. This is the haunting story of a royal born to grandeur who died in silence. Prince George Edward Alexander Edmund was born on December 20th, 1902, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, arriving into the very core of Britain's ruling dynasty. As the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary, his birth was marked not only by celebration, but by immediate expectation. Though far from the direct line of succession, George's life was shaped from the beginning by the unspoken understanding that every royal child existed to serve crown, country, and tradition. Individual desire was secondary to duty, and personal freedom was limited by protocol from the cradle onward. Raised alongside his brothers, Edward, Albert, and Henry, George grew up in an atmosphere of rigid discipline and emotional restraint. King George V was a stern and formal father who believed deeply in structure, obedience, and preparation for service. Affection was rarely expressed openly, and the royal children were expected to mature quickly, displaying composure well beyond their years. Daily life followed strict schedules, with lessons in history, religion, languages, and constitutional responsibility taking precedence over play. Even childhood games were carefully supervised to reinforce discipline and hierarchy. Prince George's mother, Queen Mary, played a central role in shaping his sense of duty and propriety. Deeply devoted to monarchy and tradition, she instilled in her children a reverence for the crown and an unwavering belief in service as a moral obligation. From an early age, George was taught that royal privilege was not a right but a burden, one that demanded sacrifice, restraint, and loyalty to the institution above all else. This philosophy would guide his life choices and shape his internal struggles as he grew older. The early 20th century was a period of immense transition for Britain, and George's upbringing reflected the pressures facing the monarchy itself. The royal household emphasized visibility, ceremonial appearances, and military readiness as essential to maintaining public confidence. As a boy, George accompanied his family to formal events, state occasions, and public ceremonies, learning how to project dignity and stability even when personal feelings were hidden. These experiences trained him to perform his role flawlessly, though often at the cost of emotional expression. Like his brothers, George was steered toward military service as a natural extension of royal duty. From his earliest years, his education and environment pointed him toward a life of uniform, command, and public responsibility. The expectation was not simply that he would serve, but that he would embody the ideal royal officer, disciplined, loyal, and uncomplaining. This path was presented not as a choice, but as destiny. Yet beneath the polished surface of privilege lay a childhood marked by constraint and quiet pressure. George grew up keenly aware that his identity was inseparable from the crown he served. While he enjoyed access to wealth, education, and influence denied to most, he also faced the lifelong challenge of living according to an image defined long before he could shape his own. However, unlike some members of the royal family whose military affiliations were largely symbolic, Prince George approached service with seriousness and personal commitment. Coming of age in the aftermath of the First World War, he belonged to a generation shaped by sacrifice, loss, and a renewed belief that royalty must earn public respect through genuine contribution. For George, military life offered not only a clear sense of purpose, but also an escape from the rigid ceremonial confines of royal existence. Uniform and rank provided structure, identity, and a measure of equality with others who served. His career began in the Royal Navy during the early 1920s, where he underwent formal training and served at sea like any other young officer. Life aboard ship was demanding and highly disciplined, yet George embraced it fully. The Navy exposed him to long periods away from court life, immersing him in an environment where performance mattered more than lineage. Fellow servicemen often noted his professionalism and willingness to follow orders without relying on royal privilege. These years helped him develop resilience, technical skill, and a deeper understanding of the realities faced by Britain's armed forces. As aviation emerged as a defining force of modern warfare, George recognized the importance of air power to Britain's future defense. In the 1930s, he transitioned to the Royal Air Force, a move that reflected both personal interest and strategic foresight. The RAF offered a modern, forward-looking identity that contrasted with the deeply traditional royal institution he had been born into. For George, flying symbolized progress, independence, and a break from inherited expectations. Within the RAF, he was particularly drawn to training and organizational roles rather than frontline prestige. His work with RAF Training Command placed him in positions that shaped the next generation of pilots and aircrew at a time when Europe was edging closer to conflict. He took these responsibilities seriously, understanding that well-prepared personnel would be crucial in any future war. Rather than seeking public acclaim, George focused on improving standards, morale, and practical readiness. Equally important was his commitment to the welfare of servicemen. Prince George showed a genuine interest in the lives of those under his command, frequently engaging with airmen and officers alike. He visited bases, hospitals, and training centers, listening to concerns about living conditions, family pressures, and the psychological toll of service. This empathy distinguished him from more distant royal figures and earned him quiet respect within military circles. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, George consistently framed his military work as duty rather than entitlement. He resisted being treated as merely a royal mascot in uniform, preferring roles where he could contribute meaningfully behind the scenes. His service ethos reflected the values instilled in him since childhood: discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. But it also revealed a deeply personal desire to be useful on his own merits. By the eve of the Second World War, Prince George had established himself as a working royal whose military career was rooted in substance rather than symbolism. His dedication to training, organization, and servicemen's welfare demonstrated a quiet but lasting commitment to the nation he served, reinforcing the belief that true service required effort, humility, and responsibility, qualities he carried with him throughout his life. On November 29, 1934, Prince George's life took a deeply personal turn when he married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The wedding was more than a royal spectacle. It symbolized a rare moment of happiness and emotional fulfillment for a man whose life had long been defined by restraint and obligation. Marina, elegant, cosmopolitan, and warm in temperament, brought a freshness and emotional openness that contrasted with the rigid traditions of the British court. Their union was widely celebrated, not only for its glamour but for the genuine affection that appeared to bind them. Princess Marina adapted quickly to her new role within the British royal family, winning public admiration for her grace and sincerity. For George, marriage provided a sense of emotional refuge that had been largely absent in his earlier life. Friends and observers noted that he seemed lighter in spirit after the wedding, more relaxed and openly affectionate than he had ever been before. The couple shared common interests in art, culture, and service, and their partnership was widely viewed as one of the most harmonious royal marriages of the era. The arrival of their children deepened this happiness. Their first child, Prince Edward, was born on October 9, 1935, bringing immense joy and a renewed sense of purpose to George's life. As the future Duke of Kent, Edward represented both continuity and hope, linking George's personal happiness with the enduring future of the monarchy. Unlike the emotionally distant parenting style George had experienced as a child, he was determined to be more present and affectionate with his own children. Two more children followed in quick succession: Princess Alexandra, born in 1936, and Prince Michael, born in 1942. Despite the increasing pressures of public duty and the looming shadow of global conflict, George and Marina worked to create a stable and nurturing family environment. Home life became a rare sanctuary, offering moments of normalcy amid the demands of royal life. George took pride in simple domestic routines, finding comfort in fatherhood and in watching his children grow. Yet these years of family joy unfolded against a backdrop of mounting responsibility and uncertainty. As Europe drifted toward war, George's military and public roles intensified, placing new strains on family life. Long separations, official travel, and the weight of duty increasingly pulled him away from home. Marina, though devoted, was often left to shoulder the emotional burden of maintaining stability for their young family. By the early 1940s, the darkness of war had fully descended. The sense of security that had defined the early years of George's marriage began to erode under the constant pressure of national crisis. While fatherhood had grounded him emotionally, it also heightened his awareness of risk and loss. The joy he found in his family now coexisted with a quiet anxiety as the world around them grew more dangerous and unpredictable. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 marked a turning point in Prince George's life, transforming his sense of duty from peacetime service into urgent national responsibility. As Britain faced an existential threat, George did not retreat into ceremonial safety. Instead, he intensified his military involvement, determined to serve not merely as a symbol of unity, but as an active participant in the war effort. The conflict demanded visibility, leadership, and morale, and George stepped forward to meet those demands with quiet resolve. By this stage, he held senior responsibilities within the Royal Air Force, a role that carried both prestige and genuine risk. Aviation was central to Britain's defense, especially during the Battle of Britain, and George's position placed him close to the heart of the nation's survival strategy. His duties involved frequent travel to RAF stations across the country, where he inspected facilities, met with commanders, and spoke directly with pilots and ground crews who faced daily danger. These visits were not superficial appearances. George took a sincere interest in operational readiness, training standards, and the welfare of personnel. Morale became one of his most critical responsibilities. At a time when airmen endured relentless pressure, exhaustion, and loss, George's presence offered reassurance and solidarity. He spoke with servicemen as equals, listening to their concerns and acknowledging the personal sacrifices they made. Many were struck by his lack of pretension and his willingness to stand among them rather than above them. For a royal accustomed to rigid protocol, this hands-on engagement reflected a deeply held belief that leadership required proximity to those bearing the heaviest burdens. The war years also placed George directly in harm's way. Unlike many members of the royal family who remained largely insulated from physical danger, his role required constant movement, often by air, at a time when aviation carried significant risk even outside combat zones. Wartime flights were unpredictable, subject to mechanical failure, poor weather, and enemy action. Yet George accepted these risks without complaint, viewing them as inseparable from his responsibilities. He resisted special treatment, believing that exemption from danger would undermine the very morale he was tasked with strengthening. As the conflict dragged on, the strain of these duties became increasingly evident. Long absences from home separated him from his wife and young children, deepening the personal cost of service. Still, he remained committed, balancing family devotion with an unyielding sense of obligation to country. The war sharpened his understanding of sacrifice, not only in terms of national loss, but in the quiet personal toll exacted on those who served continuously under pressure. By 1942, Prince George stood as one of the most actively engaged royals of the war effort, embodying a model of service rooted in action rather than ceremony. His work during these years reinforced the monarchy's relevance at a time of national crisis, demonstrating that duty extended beyond titles and appearances. Yet this very dedication placed him on a path of increasing exposure to danger, stripping away the protective distance traditionally afforded to royalty. In the summer of 1942, Prince George experienced a moment of profound personal significance that stood in stark contrast to the darkness of wartime Britain. On July 4, 1942, his wife, Princess Marina, gave birth to their third child, Prince Michael of Kent. The arrival of a new baby during the height of World War II was, under ordinary circumstances, a cause for unrestrained celebration. For George and Marina, it brought a brief but deeply felt sense of renewal, a reminder of life, continuity, and hope amid a world consumed by conflict. The birth came at a time when George's responsibilities were heavier than ever. His work with the Royal Air Force required constant travel, long separations from his family, and exposure to real danger. Yet the arrival of Prince Michael offered a rare emotional anchor. Friends and family later recalled that George was deeply moved by the birth of his youngest child, acutely aware of how precious and fragile such moments had become in wartime. Fatherhood, already central to his identity, took on an even sharper emotional intensity. For Princess Marina, welcoming a newborn during war carried its own quiet anxieties. Britain was still enduring air raids, shortages, and the daily uncertainty of loss. Raising 3 young children while her husband's duties placed him frequently in harm's way demanded resilience and emotional strength. Still, the birth of Prince Michael symbolized endurance, a personal affirmation that life continued even as Europe was locked in devastation. The joy surrounding Prince Michael's arrival, however, was tempered by unspoken fear. George knew that his work increasingly required air travel under hazardous conditions, and he was painfully aware of how swiftly fortune could change. Unlike royal births in peacetime, this moment was not insulated by certainty or long-term security. Happiness existed side by side with apprehension, as if everyone sensed that time itself had become dangerously unpredictable. Tragically, that sense of foreboding proved justified. Just 7 weeks after Prince Michael's birth, Prince George would lose his life in an aircraft crash while on active service. The timing gave the event an almost unbearable poignancy. A child who would grow up never knowing his father had entered the world only weeks before George was gone. What should have been the beginning of a new chapter instead became intertwined with sudden and irreversible loss. On the morning of August 25, 1942, tragedy struck with brutal and irreversible force. Prince George, Duke of Kent, boarded a Royal Air Force short Sunderland flying boat, serial number W4026, at RAF Invergordon in northern Scotland. The flight was intended to be routine, a wartime journey to Iceland connected to his ongoing RAF duties. Despite the dangers inherent in wartime aviation, nothing about the mission suggested it would become one of the most devastating royal tragedies of the 20th century. Approximately 32 minutes after takeoff, disaster unfolded. While flying along the rugged coastline of Caithness, the aircraft veered off course and collided with Eagles Rock, a remote and unforgiving hillside near the village of Dunbeath. The impact was catastrophic. The Sunderland was torn apart on contact, erupting into flames and debris scattered across the steep terrain. Of the 15 men aboard, 14 were killed instantly. Prince George was among them. He was just 39 years old. The shock rippled quickly through Britain. In the midst of a war already defined by constant loss, the sudden death of a senior royal on active service struck a particularly deep chord. Prince George was not a ceremonial passenger sheltered from danger. He was a working RAF officer traveling under the same hazardous conditions as countless servicemen. His death underscored the reality that even royalty was not immune to the risks of war. Recovery efforts were slow and harrowing due to the isolated location and difficult terrain. The wreckage lay strewn across the hillside, a grim testament to the violence of the crash. Investigators later concluded that poor weather, navigational error, and low cloud likely contributed to the aircraft's fatal descent. Wartime conditions limited the depth of inquiry, and many questions would linger for decades, fueling speculation and rumor. Yet the core truth remained unshaken. This was a tragic accident born of war's relentless danger. The personal cost was staggering. Just 7 weeks earlier, Prince George had welcomed his third child, Prince Michael, into the world. He left behind his wife, Princess Marina, suddenly widowed at 35, and 3 young children who would grow up with little more than photographs and memories shaped by others' recollections. The cruel timing amplified the sorrow, turning what should have been a season of family joy into one of profound grief. For the monarchy, George's death was a sobering moment. He had represented a modern model of royal service, active, visible, and genuinely committed to national duty. His loss reinforced the idea that service carried real sacrifice, even at the highest levels. Public mourning was widespread, yet restrained, shaped by a nation already accustomed to heartbreak and determined to endure. Prince George was buried with full military honors, his death acknowledged not simply as a royal loss, but as the death of an officer in service to his country. In the broader narrative of World War II, his passing became a symbol of shared vulnerability, a reminder that the war spared no family, no matter how powerful. The crash at Dunbeath ended a life defined by duty, discipline, and quiet dedication. It froze Prince George in history as a man who lived and died by the values he was raised to uphold. In a single moment on a mist-covered Scottish hillside, personal promise, family happiness, and royal service were extinguished together, leaving behind a legacy forever intertwined with sacrifice. Prince George's death carried a significance that extended far beyond the tragic circumstances of an air crash. It was not simply the loss of a young duke, husband, and father, nor even the death of a senior royal figure. Historically, his passing marked a moment without precedent in modern Britain. He became the first member of the British royal family to die while on active military service in more than 450 years. The last comparable loss had occurred in the 16th century, a reminder of how profoundly the nature of monarchy and warfare had changed since then. For centuries, British royalty had gradually been insulated from the direct dangers of battle. While kings and princes often held military titles, their involvement increasingly became symbolic, designed to inspire rather than expose them to real harm. Prince George's death shattered that long-standing separation. In the midst of World War II, his passing served as stark evidence that the war reached into every corner of British life, sparing no family, no institution, and not even the monarchy itself. The timing amplified its emotional and symbolic weight. Britain in 1942 was enduring some of the darkest days of the conflict. The war's outcome was still uncertain, casualties mounted daily, and morale was under constant strain. Against this backdrop, George's death resonated as both a personal tragedy and a national symbol of shared sacrifice. He was not lost in a palace or far from danger, but in uniform, on duty, exposed to the same risks faced by countless servicemen. This reality gave his death a moral gravity that few royal losses had ever carried. For his family, the blow was devastating. Princess Marina was left widowed with 3 young children, including an infant son who would never know his father. For King George VI, the loss of his younger brother was deeply personal, compounding the immense pressure he already carried as a wartime monarch. The royal family, so often perceived as distant or untouchable, was suddenly and visibly humanized by grief. Public reaction reflected this duality of sorrow and symbolism. While wartime censorship and restraint limited outward displays of mourning, the emotional impact was unmistakable. Newspapers and radio broadcasts framed George's death as the ultimate expression of duty, a royal who had not merely encouraged sacrifice, but embodied it. For many Britons, His passing reinforced the sense that everyone, regardless of status, was bound together by the same risks and responsibilities. Historically, George's death subtly reshaped expectations of royal service. It underscored the idea that royal duty in the modern age required more than ceremonial presence. It demanded real engagement and, at times, real danger. His loss strengthened the monarchy's connection to the public at a time when unity was essential for national survival. In the immediate aftermath of the crash that killed Prince George, the Royal Air Force convened a formal court of inquiry to determine the cause of the disaster. Conducted under wartime conditions, the investigation was necessarily swift and constrained. Britain in 1942 was fighting for survival, and operational secrecy, limited resources, and the urgency of the war effort shaped how deeply such inquiries could probe. While the loss of a senior royal intensified public interest, the inquiry itself was handled with the same procedural limits applied to many wartime aviation accidents. The official conclusion was stark and pragmatic. Investigators determined that pilot error, combined with navigational deviation, had caused the short Sunderland flying boat to stray off its intended course and descend into dangerously high terrain. Poor weather conditions, low cloud cover, and limited visibility were cited as contributing factors. In an era before advanced radar and modern navigation systems, even experienced crews were vulnerable to disorientation, particularly when flying along rugged coastlines such as those of northern Scotland. Yet the brevity and restraint of the official findings left many questions unanswered. Details of the flight's final moments were sparse, and the isolation of the crash site made recovery and reconstruction extremely difficult. The aircraft had been destroyed on impact, leaving little physical evidence to analyze. Over time, it became known that some documents related to the inquiry were either lost, destroyed, or never released, a circumstance not uncommon during wartime but deeply unsettling given the identity of one of the victims. These gaps in the historical record proved fertile ground for speculation. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate questioning whether the crash had been a simple accident. Some theories suggested mechanical failure inadequately addressed in the report. Others hinted at navigational sabotage or undisclosed military objectives linked to the flight. The survival of a single crew member only added to the intrigue, as fragments of testimony were often interpreted through the lens of suspicion rather than context. More sensational theories emerged in later decades, fueled by declassified files, memoirs, and the enduring fascination with royal secrecy. Claims ranged from covert diplomatic missions to internal security concerns, though none were supported by conclusive evidence. The lack of transparency, combined with the passage of time, allowed imagination to flourish where documentation fell silent. It is important to note that wartime accident investigations were rarely comprehensive by modern standards. The RAF was losing aircraft and crews at an unprecedented rate, and inquiries were designed primarily to improve operational safety, not to satisfy public curiosity. The presence of a royal did not fundamentally alter this reality, though it dramatically heightened scrutiny in hindsight. The unresolved questions surrounding Prince George's death have ensured that the crash at Dunbeath remains one of the most discussed royal tragedies of the 20th century. While the official explanation of pilot error and navigational misjudgment remains the only substantiated conclusion, the missing details have given the event an enduring aura of mystery. This uncertainty has added an extra layer of tragedy to an already devastating loss. For the Duke of Kent's family, the absence of clear answers likely compounded grief with lingering doubt. For historians and the public alike, the case stands as a reminder of how war obscures truth as easily as it claims lives. In the days following Prince George's sudden death in August 1942, Britain paused to mourn not only a royal duke, but a fallen officer who had died in service to his country. His remains were brought back from Scotland under solemn military escort, and his funeral reflected the dual nature of his life, royal by birth serviceman by choice. He was initially laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, a place reserved for monarchs and close members of the royal family, underscoring the significance of his loss to both the crown and the nation. The funeral took place during wartime austerity, stripped of the grandeur that would have accompanied such a ceremony in peacetime. Yet the restraint only heightened its emotional power. Military honors were rendered with quiet dignity, and the presence of senior royals, uniformed officers, and government representatives reflected the deep respect he had earned through genuine service. For the public, his burial symbolized a shared moment of grief in a war already heavy with sacrifice. More than 2 decades later, in 1968, Prince George's remains were moved to the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, near Windsor. There, he was laid to rest among other members of the extended royal family, in a setting that emphasized intimacy and continuity rather than grandeur. The relocation placed him close to his wife, Princess Marina, allowing in death the physical proximity that war and duty had so often denied them in life. When Marina herself died in 1968, she was buried beside him, reuniting the couple after years of separation by history and circumstance. The personal consequences of George's death were most deeply felt within his immediate family. Princess Marina, widowed at just 35, was left to raise 3 young children alone during the final years of World War II. Her grief was compounded by the demands of royal duty and public expectation, which allowed little room for private mourning. Despite these pressures, Marina emerged as a figure of resilience, devoting herself to her children and to charitable and public work that honored her husband's legacy of service. Their eldest son, Prince Edward, inherited the title Duke of Kent at the age of 6, a responsibility far beyond his years. Growing up without his father's guidance, Edward's childhood was shaped by absence as much as inheritance. Though surrounded by family support, the loss left a lasting imprint, influencing his understanding of duty, identity, and service. His eventual commitment to public and military roles reflected a quiet continuation of the values his father had embodied. Prince George's death left a legacy defined by sacrifice rather than scandal or ceremony. He came to be remembered as a working royal who had accepted real risk in the service of his country, bridging the gap between monarchy and the lived experience of wartime Britain. Over time, his story has remained a poignant example of how history can abruptly alter the course of a family and a life. What do you think about Prince George? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.